Climate change. Whose fault is it? In this lecture, I will give a brief overview of climate change, its causes, and consequences. I will also discuss Sinnott-Armstrong's paper, It Isn't My Fault, Global Warming and Individual Moral Obligations. Let's start with climate change, also known as global warming. Climate change is the change of the overall global temperature and large weather patterns on the planet. The kind of climate change that is relevant to us involves a significant increase in global temperatures. Scientists estimate that the planet is over 1 degree Celsius warmer than it used to be when we started measuring global temperature systematically. Climate change, as we face it, is caused by the increasing amounts of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The most prominent of these greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide and methane. Indeed, there is a strong correlation between the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide and global temperatures. Yet, maybe we shouldn't jump to any conclusions about causation. As the old adage goes, correlation is not causation. Indeed, we can find all sorts of things that are strongly correlated to global temperatures. For instance, the decline of oceanic piracy. Of course, it would be absurd to conclude that the Earth is warming up because we have fewer pirates. Is the theory that the Earth is warming up because we have more greenhouse gases equally absurd? I don't think so, because in the case of greenhouse gases, we have a mechanism that explains and predicts the correlation. In the case of pirates, we don't have an explanation why fewer pirates would warm up the planet. The mechanism linking greenhouse gases and global temperatures is a simple matter of physics. The Earth has a heat budget. It gets a certain amount of heat from the sun in the form of sunlight. It also loses heat to space in the form of infrared light. Sunlight is simple. It is the stuff you see when you look at the sun, hopefully while wearing your sunglasses. What about infrared? It is also easy. If you hold your hands close to a heat source, like a radiative electric heater, you can feel the warmth on your skin, even if the room is very cold. That feeling is caused by the infrared light emitted by the heater. Now, what does that have to do with climate change? As I said, the Earth has a heat budget. When the heat absorbed is less than the heat lost to space, the Earth cools down. When the heat absorbed is more than the heat lost, the Earth warms up. That is what has been happening in the last 100 years or so. Here's how. The sunlight hits the Earth. Part of that heat that light carries is absorbed by the Earth's surface and slowly emitted back to space in the form of infrared. That's how the surface of the Earth cools itself. But greenhouse gases are transparent to sunlight, but a little bit opaque to infrared light. That means they let the heat from the sun freely come in, but when the surface of the Earth tries to cool itself, greenhouse gases capture that heat and trap it in the atmosphere, and eventually emit it back to Earth. That's why these gases are called greenhouse gases. They trap the heat as in a greenhouse. What is the big deal, one might ask? The big deal is the consequences of this heating effect. The extra heat retained by the atmosphere leads to the melting of the sea ice, polar ice caps, and glaciers. For instance, the Arctic sea ice has been steadily shrinking since the 1980s. Satellite imagery shows that the current area covered by ice around the North Pole is less than half of the coverage 40 years ago, with devastating consequences to the local ecosystems. The difference is simply startling. The melting of the sea ice by itself isn't a huge problem. A bigger concern is the melting of the glaciers and the Antarctic ice cap, because the ice that is floating doesn't change the sea levels if it melts. However, the ice over land is entirely a different story. The water generated by melting of glaciers will increase the sea level. The oceans are also getting warmer, and water expands when heated. This is called thermal expansion of the oceans. All of this combined is expected to lead to a significant increase in sea levels. How much depends on how hot it will get. However, the worst case scenario is about a 200 feet rise of the sea levels. That would create new inner seas in Australia, South America, and Asia. What's worse, nearly all coastal areas will flood permanently. More than half of the world population live in those coastal areas. Most large cities will be wiped out. New York City, Rome, Shanghai, London, Houston, Bangkok, Amsterdam, Athens, Sydney, Buenos Aires, Los Angeles, Beijing, and many other large cities will be mostly or completely submerged. That's the worst case scenario, of course, which is very unlikely. But as you can see from the slow death of New Orleans, a coastal city doesn't need to be completely submerged to become inhospitable to human life. Even a 20 feet increase in sea levels would be enough to make coastal cities much more vulnerable to hurricanes. Which brings me to hurricanes. The rising ocean temperatures are expected to cause a greater frequency and intensity of hurricanes and other extreme weather events. This is so because these events are primarily caused by warm ocean water. As we shall see later in the course, most of these predictions are subject to uncertainties, which are relevant to determining what our moral obligations are as individuals and societies. Today, however, we are going to ignore these uncertainties and give into something basic about human nature. Whenever something terrible happens, people tend to look for someone to blame. That's why whose fault is climate change is a very popular question. Sometimes enlightened city folks such as myself and some in my audience put the blame on the hicks and hillbillies from the southern states. If only some people think those hicks didn't drive gas guzzlers. Let's imagine for a second that I'm not an enlightened city folk. I'm one of those hicks. I own a Ram 1500 TRX 4-wheel drive which has a 6-liter V8 engine that runs about 10 miles per gallon. If you aren't familiar with that sort of thing, for the record, that's awful fuel economy. Let's also say I take this baby out for a joyride every Sunday. Not to go to church to worship Jesus Christ, not to go deer hunting, not to haul stuff around. I drive my truck just to have the fun of driving a big, loud, wasteful machine. This, of course, generates a bunch of carbon dioxide, which is the main driver of climate change. Is it wrong for me to do this? Is it wrong to engage in wasteful driving? An influential moral philosopher named William Sinnott-Armstrong has an answer to this question. His answer is no. It is not wrong to take out my gas guzzler out for a joyride every Sunday. His answer is based on an argument which I will call the main argument. Here's how the main argument goes. If we knew that wasteful driving is morally wrong, we would have a plausible moral principle that shows that it is morally wrong. We do not have a plausible moral principle that shows that wasteful driving is morally wrong. Therefore, we don't know that wasteful driving is morally wrong. Most of Sinnott-Armstrong's paper is dedicated to establishing the second premise of his main argument. Here is his strategy. He lists a bunch of moral principles one might adhere to, and keeps listing and listing. And then he goes through each principle to convince his audience that that principle doesn't show that wasteful driving is wrong. Of course, I'm not going to do that. I will give you an abridged version. I will explain how he does that with just these 4 principles. Let's start with the harm principle. The harm principle says that we have a moral obligation not to perform an act that causes harm to others. The harm principle seems plausible. If something hurts others, don't do it, right? Now, does the harm principle show that wasteful driving is wrong? Sinnott-Armstrong thinks no, because wasteful driving at the individual scale doesn't cause any harm to others. He says on page 298, the harms of global warming result from the massive quantities of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Greenhouse gases are perfectly fine in small quantities. They help plants grow. The problem emerges only when there is too much of them. But my joyride by itself does not cause the massive quantities that are harmful. And he's right. The total global carbon dioxide emissions is about 40 gigatons, which amounts to 50 gigatons when you factor in other greenhouse gases such as methane. This is the equivalent of 50 trillion kilograms of carbon dioxide. Adding or subtracting a few hundred kilograms would make no detectable difference. One might also question whether the harm principle itself is plausible or not. Is it always morally wrong to perform an action that causes harm to others? I will let you think about this one. Next, there is the Universalizability Principle. It says we have a moral obligation not to act on any maxim that we cannot will to be a universal law. I know this one is a mouthful, so let's try to decipher what exactly it is trying to say. Let's start with the word maxim. What's a maxim? A maxim is a description of an act and why the agent performs that act. Think about a bank robber. His action is stealing. But the maxim behind his action is more than that. It also contains a purpose that explains why he steals. His maxim is to steal so that he can live luxuriously without effort. Okay, now that we know what a maxim is, how do I apply the universalizability principle to figure out whether an action is morally wrong or not? Here's how. We first identify the maxim of the action in question. Then we imagine a world in which everyone is acting on that same maxim. And finally, we think about whether or not the purpose contained in the maxim can be achieved by all. If they can all achieve that purpose, the action is universalizable and morally permissible. If they cannot all achieve that purpose, then it is not universalizable and it is morally wrong. If that sounds too abstract, let's go back to Mr. Bank Robber. We have already identified his maxim. His maxim is to steal so that he can live luxuriously without effort. Then we imagine a world where everyone, absolutely everyone, acts on that same maxim. So everyone steals. I mean everyone. Everyone in this class, everyone you know, your parents, your boss, your professors, everyone. Now, could they all achieve their purpose? Would these people in this imaginary world live luxuriously without effort? Of course they cannot. They cannot because if everyone steals constantly, then no wealth can be generated or accumulated. Luxury would be impossible. If you don't see why, consider this. Suppose that you robbed the Federal Reserve and stole, let's say, $1 million. You bought a Ferrari with it. Then someone will come along and steal it. So you won't be able to enjoy your sports car. Or you go to a nice Caribbean island and lie down on a bench on the beach and start sipping a cold drink. Not too fast because someone will soon come steal the bench under your butt and the drink from your hands. As you can see, everyone trying to act on this maxim is self-defeating. That's why the action in question is morally wrong according to the universalizability principle. In other words, you shouldn't steal to live luxuriously without effort. It would be morally wrong. Now that we know how to apply the universalizability principle, let's apply it to my wasteful driving. First, we identify my maxim, which is to drive once a week to have fun. Then we imagine a world where everyone does that. They drive once a week to have fun. Okay, we imagine that. Now there are billions of trucks being driven around for no reason other than fun. Sounds like Texas, actually. Then we ask whether these quasi-Texans can achieve their purpose. Can they all have fun? Heck yeah, they can. That, of course, provides the answer to the moral question. The universalizability principle doesn't show that wasteful driving is wrong. Again, you can question whether the universalizability principle itself is plausible or not. I will leave this for you to think about. Then there is the ideal law principle, which says we have a moral obligation not to perform an action if that action should be illegal, ideally speaking. This one also seems like a plausible principle. Imagine going to a nature preserve with a beautiful lagoon. Then you see someone mindlessly tossing a plastic bottle into that lagoon. You tell him that he shouldn't do that. He turns around and says, "I see no signs that prohibit tossing a bottle into this lagoon." Of course, his response, even if it is correct, is absurd. You shouldn't litter, even if the actual law doesn't prohibit littering, because the ideal law would. Sinnott-Armstrong, however, doesn't think that the ideal law principle will get you the conclusion that wasteful driving is wrong. Why, after all, would anyone think that the ideal law would prohibit wasteful driving? Wouldn't he ask efficiency inducements for people who don't drive gas guzzlers and extra tax burdens for wasteful drivers such as myself achieve the same goal as prohibition without inviting unwanted side effects and prohibition? And again, it is fair to ask whether the ideal law principle is morally plausible or not. This too, I will leave for you to think about. And last, we will look at Sinnott-Armstrong's treatment of the general action principle, which says we have a moral obligation not to perform an act when it would be worse for everyone to perform an act of the same kind. This too, on the face of it, is an attractive principle. Think about the guy who littered. If everyone acted like him, that lagoon would quickly be ruined. So you might think he ought not litter. As you have probably guessed, Sinnott-Armstrong isn't impressed. He doesn't think that the general action principle can show that wasteful driving is wrong. In this case, however, he is not impressed because he thinks that the principle itself is implausible. He mentions, for instance, if everyone refrained from having kids, humanity would go extinct. Does that mean that everyone must have kids? I'm not sure, however, if his criticism works. But once again, I will let you think about this one for yourself. We looked at only 4 principles and how Sinnott-Armstrong argued that neither of which shows that wasteful driving is wrong. In the paper, as you read, he tries to do the same thing for all 13 principles he brings up. His conclusion is always the same. Each principle falls short of showing that wasteful driving is wrong. And that's how he tries to justify the second premise of his main argument. I will leave you with 3 questions. First, can you think of any objections against the main argument? Second, do you think that wasteful driving is wrong? And why? Why not? And third, what's the upshot of all of this? Suppose he's right. Suppose we don't know that wasteful driving is morally wrong. So what? This brings me to the end of this lecture. Send me a message if you have any questions. Thank you for your patience, and I'll catch you next time.